Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The coffee pot hissed and spat in the cramped kitchen, sending up thin, ghostly threads of steam that twisted in the early cold. A gray wash of dawn lay over the ranch house, over the rough-hewn table and the chipped mug and the sagging dish rack. Outside, frost whited the porch railings and the horse trough glinted like tin. Silas Avery stood at the stove with his arms folded across his chest, waiting for the machine to give him the first bitter swallow of the day. He didn't turn when the girl, not a girl really, but a young woman, cleared her throat behind him. He'd heard the squeak of the door hinges, the light footfalls, the cautious way she paused like a deer closing ground on a salt lick. Her name was Nora Swan. She was slight and quiet, wearing a coat too big for her that swallowed her hands and brushed the backs of her knees. She'd arrived the night before, nerves knotted tight, her duffel held in front of her like a shield. Silas had seen plenty of women in his 62 years. He knew tired women and angry women, women who wore their care like armor and women who wore their hunger like perfume. Nora wasn't like any of them. She was 24, she'd told him, though she kept smoothing that age down in her own mind, apologizing for taking up space, apologizing for being almost. She had a braid pulled low, and eyes he couldn't catalog because they kept wanting to close against the world. Now she stood there, and even before she spoke he felt the tight thread of it, the word like a bead rolling on a string. "Mr. Avery," she said, her voice thin. I'll do anything a man wants." The coffee maker clicked. Silas's hand hovered over the mug, and he froze, not because he didn't understand, not because he wasn't quick enough to respond, but because the sound of those words reached into a part of him he rarely let himself visit. 13, and watching a barroom door swing open, and a woman with a black eye sweep the floor, his father not lifting his head, 30 and drunk enough to be stupid, 48 and kneeling by his wife's bed wishing for a deal with a God he no longer believed in. In the quiet after her plea, the kitchen took a breath, the refrigerator hummed to fill it. Outside, the rooster crowed his late confusion, as if finally remembering he had a job to do. Silas turned toward her. He saw the set of her mouth, a practiced flare of lips that wasn't a smile, a freezing of expression like a mask placed in a hurry. He saw the bruise yellowing along the hinge of her jaw where the collarbone rose, and the way she flinched at his movement and then didn't. "No," he said. The word fell between them and spread out like a pond ripple, disturbing her mask. He didn't raise his voice. He set the coffee down and wiped his hand on a towel and let the silence work for him. "No," he said again, kinder. "That's not going to be the arrangement here." Nora swallowed. She was breathing like someone who had sprinted up a hill and caved in at the top. The look she gave him, then he couldn't have put into words hope at war with horror. She nodded, then shook her head, as if trying to find the thread again. "I need the job," she said, staring at the floor. "I don't, sir. I can do a lot. Cooking, cleaning. I can mend the shirts you don't care to throw away. It's just sometimes men, if they want." She found herself twisting the strap of her duffel until her knuckles blanched. "I'm not good at saying no fast enough. I thought I better say, 'You're safe here,'" Silas said, and he realized he was holding his breath too. The words felt dangerous and sacred, a thing not to offer lightly, not if you intended to keep it. He watched her eyes in case those words rang false to her, in case she'd heard them too many times. "The job is the job, Nora. Wages are wages. I expect a paycheck's worth of work. I don't expect anything else." She blinked twice, the rope inside of her slackening by degrees, and the first real breath she took in his kitchen sounded like a confession. She nodded. He waited, and when she didn't bolt or cry or offer that awful bargain again, he felt a small loosening inside himself too, a rusted hinge giving way. He poured 2 coffees and set one near her hand. "Cream," he said, lifting the carton. Sugar's in the blue jar. There's a rhythm to the place I'll show you, if you're willing to learn the dance. She almost smiled at that. Not with her mouth, which didn't seem to know how, but with the way her shoulders moved. Yes, she said, I'm willing. They started slow. The house had its particular species of neglect. The places an old man stopped caring about were not the places an old woman would have. Dust had scooped itself into pious corners that didn't affect the path from his bedroom to the kitchen to the porch. Cups were mismatched congregations. Towels had decided they'd live until string. The knives, though, were sharp. The boots by the door were lined up like soldiers on that first morning. Silas showed her the pantry where the flour kept to itself at the back and the beans held court up front. He pointed out the trap's loose floorboard by the fridge, the screen door latch that needed a nudge with a fingertip, the water heater temperamental as a bull. He told her where the spare key was to the workshop, and the rules for the dogs, and the way the hills looked when a storm brewed. I don't need coddling, Nora said once, the closest thing to sass he'd heard yet, and he nearly liked that more than he should have. He nodded and let her find the rhythm herself after that, stepping in only when it seemed the strings were going to knot. In the afternoons, she scrubbed the sink until it reflected the window, and the window until it reflected the sky. She asked small, practical questions. Where to hang the wash rags to dry so they didn't sour, which oil to use for the cast iron, if there was a way to get the prickly pears off the back fence without getting spiked. Silas answered in his slow drawl, and when he didn't know or didn't see the usefulness of the question, he said so without meanness. He learned the rhythm of her silences. He learned that she listened for footsteps even when she knew his belonged to him, that she arranged the silverware so every knife pointed inward, and that she slept with her shoes by the bed. She had a scar by her ear like the crescent moon in a child's drawing, and when the house was quiet and she thought no one was there, she hummed a tune with no words. Where'd you learn to mend like that? He asked the second week, watching her coax a seam back into truth on one of his work shirts. From Mrs. Talbot, she said. She ran the motel. She didn't like anything that looked tired. If a sheet had a tear, she'd make it a rag and then cry over the money it cost her. Her voice had gone smaller by the end of her answer. Silas didn't ask the questions the silence offered. Later she added, I wasn't there long. They settled into a pattern. The mornings were his fencing, feeding, checking water. The afternoons were hers keeping house, making lists, seasoning beans. The in-betweens, the long exhalations of day and night, they started to share without discussing it. He'd bring in an armful of sage and set it on the table like an apology for all the things he didn't know how to say. She'd set a cup of stew on the step outside the mudroom for him if she knew he'd sit there to pull his boots. He taught her to ride, because he didn't like her walking the long slope down to the lower pasture alone. She mounted the paint mare, Penny, with a determination that made him want to look away. By the second week, her hands had stopped being purely cautious. They had a little intention in them, a bit of conversation with the reins. She wore a hat he'd found in the closet, his daughter's once upon a time, too dusty to know its original color, and when she lifted her face to the sun, he saw the woman she could be if fear wasn't a house she had to live in. The neighbor, May Caldwell, stopped by to be nosy and leave pie. She took stock of Nora with a glance that could measure flour and hunger at once. You're helping my old friend? May said. He needs it, no matter what he claims. Don't let him rob you on pay. He forgets the value of things. She aimed the last sentence at Silas like a scolding, and he took it because it was easier than explaining that his forgetfulness wasn't about money. He added a few bills the next week, tucked them beneath the ledger like he'd misplaced them there by accident. Nora found them and placed them atop, squared, like she'd noticed but wouldn't name the gift. It was a small life, but it was theirs. It would have gone on like that, a slow, widening circle, if not for the storm. Clouds had been piling for days, odd shapes, the kind that didn't bring rain so much as the threat of it. On the morning, the sky cracked open. The wind came from the wrong direction, scouring the face of the house and spinning grit into every seam. Silas felt the ache in his hip announce itself like an old friend with poor manners. He didn't tell Nora he planned to check the lower fence. He just pulled on his coat and set out with a coil of wire and the pliers clamped in the back pocket of his jeans. The creek that ran through the back acres was mostly a suggestion most days. That day it remembered its birthright. By the time he slogged down through the red brush, his boots were heavy with mud and the water had jumped its banks, trying out new arguments for how the land should be arranged. A young steer had nosed itself into a natural trap at the bend, where a tangle of elm roots made a slow snarl. It stood belly deep and shivering, eyes rolling, as the water rose to meet its chest. "Damn it," Silas said to the steer, because sometimes cussing at animals was a way of dissenting from the weather. He was not foolish enough to wade in. He was not quite foolish enough. He waded in. Later, he tried to remember whether the tug on his knee came from the current, or the snag, or the torque of his own weight giving in. The pain came bright and hot and then deep, and he had to put both palms on the steer's back to keep himself upright. The anim. Al's terror ricocheted through him. He swore again and tried to walk backward, dragging the steer's weight with him by means of their shared disaster. It didn't work. The water clawed and insisted. He felt his boot slide and his foot go cold and not be where he'd left it. Nora brought the rope. He didn't see her until she was a black shape against the pewter of the day, the coat too big for her flapping like a flag. She slid down the bank on her butt, catching herself on scrub and landing in the muck with a sound. Her eyes were wide and her mouth was set. "You said your hip," she said, as if continuing a conversation they'd had. She had the rope coiled neat like a lasso, not in panicked loops. He wanted to ask where she'd learned that, but the water had made every question academic. She tossed the rope and caught the steer around the neck, but the current took its slack. "Tree," he said, pointing with his chin. "Wrap it there." She did, arms moving with a quick economy that made him see her not as slight but as competent, the way you might glance at a sack of flour and realize it weighed more than you'd thought. She took a breath and pulled, and the rope went taut, and the steer kicked its front hooves into the mud to help itself the last foot. Silas let go and let them do the work. The world narrowed to knot and pull and mud and pain. The steer lurched and slipped and then found purchase and scrambled onto the bank, bawling. Nora staggered backwards with it, rope burning across her palms until they both were on their knees in wet grass, panting. Silas tried to stand. His knee did something that felt like tearing paper, and he grunted. He put his hand on the ground, and the wet earth became both support and insult. He hated needing help like he hated nothing else, except he didn't have the luxury of pride. "Lean," Nora said, and she made a shelf of herself. He leaned, teeth gritted, and she took the weight without flinching. They moved clumsy, three-legged, his breath between his teeth, her breath counted out with careful evenness. By the time they reached the truck, the rain had softened to needles, and the steer had disappeared in the general direction of the pasture that wasn't drowning. At the house, she half carried him to the couch. His leg thundered. She peeled the wet denim away with the precision of someone opening a letter they weren't sure they should read. The skin around his knee was already swelling like bread in a warm oven. He wanted to tell her where the ice was and what he needed, and how not to fuss. She ignored all that and found the ice herself, and a towel, and the old bottle of pills from the last time he decided he was younger than he was. She pressed and wrapped and sat on the table to be near enough to catch the glass if he knocked it in his flailing. "You should go to the clinic," she said. "May can drive if you don't want me to be the one." The way she said it made him understand something. She knew what it was. To take a man someplace he didn't want to go, to tend him, and be made to pay for it. She was offering him an escape from being beholden to her. "You can take me," he said, You should drive the truck anyway. It's safer to know how. The look she gave him then had a different geography than fear. It had something like gratitude in it. He didn't say thank you either. They were stacked up in so much thanks and sorry that either of them might suffocate if they picked up a single word. The clinic was a low building 3 towns over. The doctor had a name tag that read Richard, as if he didn't belong to any family. He poked and prodded and pronounced the knee insulted, but not broken. "You're old, Mr. Avery," Richard said nicely. "Even if you don't feel it, give it 2 weeks. Consider letting someone else take the weight around here." On the way home, the sky had rinsed itself and come up blue and raw. Nora held the wheel like a promise. She didn't talk. The road unspooled between them, and Silas listened to the engine and the rattle in the glove box in his own reluctance. "The thing you said," he offered finally, because the words would die in his mouth if he didn't let them out. That first morning, Nora's fingers went white on the wheel. She nodded once. He could tell she was braced. "I've heard it too many times," he said. "Grown men thinking it's their due for paying out wages. I want you to know the line stops with me. Not because I'm good, because I'm ashamed of how long. Gee, I've let it go on in the world and not said anything." He surprised himself with the heat of the admission. He had always been better at doing than saying, but this felt like a doing too. Nora let out a breath that trembled. "Mrs. Talbot said the same thing at first," she said. "And then her brother came to visit. The rest hung there. He didn't ask. I ran after that. I got on a bus and got off a bus and mopped floors at a diner where the owner didn't look me in the eyes. A man at the gas station told me about your ad." She glanced at him then, only a flick, but it held. "I hate that the words know me. I hate that my mouth knows how to make that bargain. I want to forget it." "You will," he said, reckless with the belief. "Every day you don't have to use it, you'll forget a little more." Spring wore itself into a true thing. The prickly pears budded with those obscene, glorious flowers that made the desert look indecently proud. Nora learned the taste of rain on dust. She learned which of the heifers was always going to be troublesome and which neighbor would show up at the gate with a wrench and 3 opinions and stay for supper. She learned the names of the constellations from a book Silas had forgotten he had, and when he limped out on the porch on the nights his knee let him sit, she pointed out Orion to him like a new friend. Her past arrived one afternoon in a truck that needed a muffler and wanted the world to know it. A man climbed out of the cab with the kin. D. of swagger, the lonely favor. He had a jaw that wanted to be square and a mouth that had told too many stories. He glanced at the barn and the house, and then at Nora, who stood on the steps, her shoulders back like she had a spine she'd borrowed from someone meaner and kept it in spite of herself. "I figured you'd better apologize," he said, as if announcing the day's chore. He slid his gaze to Silas as if inviting complicity. She left without paying back what she owed. Silas felt a familiar coil of anger unspool in him. He stood with his weight on his good leg and his hands open, visible. "No one owes anybody their body," Silas said. "Not for money, not for being born. She doesn't owe you a nickel more than the law says, and I have the feeling the law wouldn't recognize any ledger you're holding up between you." The man laughed a bright, brittle sound. "She your girlfriend?" he asked Nora, derision making his vowels slick. "You finally found a soft-hearted old man to work?" Nora looked at Silas. "See," her eyes said, "this is where it gets ugly." He nodded once to her. The invitation was plain. "You decide the end to the story this time." "This is my job," she said to the man, and the words sat down between her and the past. "You don't come to my job. You don't go to any place I am at unless I tell you. If you step on this porch again, I'll call May and she'll call the sheriff, and you know May." The last was almost funny, because everyone in the county knew May and respect. "Ted her like weather. If there's money, make your case. Otherwise, turn around." The man squinted, and for a second Silas thought he'd reach for something under the seat of that rattling truck, not because the man knew how to shoot, and not because he had a plan, but because men like him loved to make scenes. Silas didn't move. He had nothing in his hands but his hands, and sometimes that was enough. It was enough. The man spat on the dirt and mumbled something that might have been for the theater of it, then climbed into his truck and revved away, dust standing up like a wall to hide his retreat. Nora sat down hard on the steps and let out a sound that wasn't crying and wasn't laughing. Silas sat next to her. They watched the dust settle. "I kept waiting for you to tell me to go inside," she said. "I don't give orders in my own house I'm not ready to enforce," he said, meaning it the way it needed to be meant. She nodded. He could feel the tremble in her without looking. He looked anyway. She had that look she got when she was about to faint and was insisting on not. He reached and touched the sleeve of her shirt. The contact was small, but it held as steady as fence post in the ground. "Thank you," she said, and then, "I didn't know I could say a thing like that and mean it." "You just did," he said. They didn't talk about romance. It rose between them like steam, not steamy but insistent, the way steam lifts from a field when the sun first unhooks from the horizon. He liked the way she laughed with the relief of it when a calf figured out legs. She liked the way he shut down a joke if it came at someone else's dignity. They ate at the table, sometimes across from each other, sometimes side by side, and when their hands brushed reaching for the salt, it felt like gratitude more than it felt like need. May told them both to stop being fools, which was her way of blessing them. "Don't let the county tell you what to feel," she said, slicing pie with conviction. "Don't let your own shame either, but be mindful. There's a difference between rescue and respect, and no one wants to live in a rescue." Winter came without drama. It was just a tightening of things, a bracing. The fields went the color of old parchment. Nora pulled up rugs and beat them where the grass had given up for the year. She wrote numbers into Silas's ledger with neat, unassuming figures, and when he asked if she wanted a different job title for tax purposes, she looked at him and said, "You can put manager if you like. I can be the manager of keeping us alive." He missed a day noticing that he had stopped wanting to leave her alone in the house because of fear. He noticed only the day he came in and didn't need to know where she was in order to know she was okay. It was trust, the dull kind, the kind you didn't hold up to the light and examine. It was the opposite of the bright fear that had brought them to this place. A flyer came to the mailbox in January. Limp wit. Rain. Community college classes offered online, one night a week in person at the library in town. The paper smelled like damp ink and hope. Nora set it on the counter and pretended it wasn't for her. Silas set his glasses on the end of his nose and pretended he needed help reading it. "You going to circle anything?" he asked, as casually as you please. She was making soup and pretending to ignore him. He pointed at a class. "Business math," he said. "Or Introduction to Horticulture." Her breath caught. He watched her choose. She circled the math first. "So I can tell May how wrong she is when she does figures in her head," she said, but her eyes were bright. She circled the horticulture too. "So I can know which things want which ground." She looked up at him then, chewing her lip. "It would be on Tuesday nights." "I can feed myself on Tuesday nights," he said. "I ate cereal for 30 years before you, Nora Swan. I haven't forgotten how," she went. On Tuesday nights, the ranch house took on a different tone in her absence. Silas listened to the refrigerator as if it might be delivering news. He ate cereal and didn't like it and made a sandwich. He sat on the couch with his leg up and watched a show where people bought houses in cities he'd never see. He missed her presence and didn't name it jealousy and didn't name it emptiness. He let it be missing. She came home with stories. They were small and they were everything. The woman at the register at the library had a laugh that made Nora like herself. The teacher for horticulture was a man who kept the labels from seed packets in a notebook because he loved to remember the names Black Crim, Brandywine, Cherokee Purple. Nora loved to say the words Brandywine, she'd say, and the kitchen would feel full. Silas watched her become more herself and tried not to interfere. He fumbled sometimes. He said the wrong thing about a skirt she wore to class and watched her close up like a clam. He apologized without explanation the next morning. A simple, "I was a fool," and she opened again. They survived his mistakes and hers. Spring came again and made a show of it, as if to apologize for so many winters. They planted tomatoes in a raised bed that let the soil warm quick. They argued about where to put the peppers, and then laughed because there are worse arguments. Dogs slept in the shade of the trough and raised an eyebrow when people raised their voices. On the day the tomatoes bloomed yellow and the first bees bumbled their law around them, Nora said, "I'm thinking of going into town full-time when the classes are finished. A job at the feed store maybe, or at May's sister's bakery." Silas set the trowel down between them. He nodded. His chest was a drawer with dividers: pride, grief, understanding, fear, and he is old enough to open it and not let the contents jumble. "That would be a good decision," he said. He tried to make his face do the right thing. She chewed her lip. "It's not to leave you," she said. "It's to leave me, the me that came here. I want to see if I can be a different me someplace else." He put his hand over hers on the dirt. The contact was steady. "You could leave me," he said, because there was a way in which he wanted her to know the truth, Bald. "If that's what you wanted, it would be all right. I would sit on the porch and drink coffee and watch the pasture square by square and know I'd had the honor of knowing you." She pressed her mouth together. She looked at his hand and then at his eyes. "I want you to say you'd miss me," she said, a little smile in it. "Not a bargain, a request." "I would miss you so much it would change my weather," he said plainly. "But you get to choose your sky." She went. She took 2 duffels and the hat that had once been his daughter's and the scarf May claimed was lucky. The house swallowed her absence with a gulp, and then wore it day by day like an old shirt he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He found her hair ties under couch cushions and on doorknobs. He kept setting 2 knives out by habit. Tuesday nights came and he didn't watch the refrigerator for news. He walked the pasture and counted cows and let himself be sad without pretending there was a lesson in it. She wrote letters, actual ones, in a hand that had traded shyness for patience. She told him about the bakery, how the ovens had personalities and the customers had names that liked sugar. She told him about the math class, how the teacher had a way of making numbers feel like mercy. She told him she was learning to say no, not as a shame, but as a sentence. She told him she thought about the ranch like a person she'd love forever but couldn't live with right now. He wrote back with stories about calves and fence menders, and a wind that had howled one night so fierce the house had leaned a little toward the north. When summer had blown itself out and fallen to its knees into fall, she came back. She came not with 2 duffels, but with 1, and a bag of flour and a stack of books. She stood on the porch and waited for him to open the door as if she was a stranger again, as if form mattered. "I brought sourdough," she said. "It makes everything feel like it's the first time." He laughed because he didn't know what else to do with the way his lungs had stopped and started. He made coffee. She set the jar of starter on the counter and watched the bubbles like stars. He wanted to ask too much. If she'd come because she needed him. If she'd stayed gone because she wanted to. If she wanted now to stay. He didn't ask any of it. He tried to be a place where she could tell the truth and not be harassed by questions. At dusk, they sat on the porch. The sky did its daily miracle. The first cyclers of bats came out. Nora folded her hands in her lap. She looked at him as if she could see the boy he'd been under the beard and the aches. "I used to say that thing," she said quietly. "The thing I told you when I came. I practiced it in mirrors before jobs. I thought it would make me safe. It never made me safe. It made me small." He watched the yard where he had sometimes buried small animals and once a wife. He watched the grass that kept growing anyway. He didn't answer right away. "I don't want to be small anymore," she said. "I don't want to barter my body or my time or my kindness to survive. I came back because—" She swallowed. She shook her head as if to clear it. "Because when I'm here, I remember I'm more than that bargain. Because you froze that morning and said no for me until I could say it. I needed that then, I can say it now." She turned her head and her eyes met his. He didn't look away. He felt the sweet old panic of a good thing within reach, and the steadier thing that had made him a decent man. "I'll do anything I want," she said, a small smile pulling at one corner of her mouth. "That's what I tell myself now. That's the bargain. I'll do anything I want. And what I want is—" She exhaled. "I want to be here, not as your maid, not to pay you back, not to take care of you as penance. I want to be here because you are you and I am me, and together we make a third thing neither of us gets alone." He felt the metaphor sit down at the table their lives had made. He didn't have fancy words. He had his hands, and the porch, and the cattle, and the sky, and the memory of a young steer saved by a rope tied to a tree. "Then stay," he said, "as my friend, as my equal, as whatever else we both can live with and be proud of. We'll say yes and no as needed. We'll make coffee in the morning and let the day tell us what kind of people we have to be. We'll call you manager if it pleases you, and we'll call me old man because that suits me fine." She laughed, and it was laughter with teeth, which he had come to consider a blessing. Later, when the stars were all the way out and the coyotes had started their hymn, she leaned her shoulder against his. He put his hand over hers on the armrest. That was all. It was enough. It was a covenant, different from a promise and harder. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a new version of the rhythm. Nora ran numbers and fences, and the dogs, who obeyed her now as if she'd always been the person they'd been waiting for. She planted cool crops in the beds that held on to the sun. She said no when a man from the feed store tried to kiss her in the alley behind May's, and then told May, and then told Silas without apology, and they all made sure that man learned something about community. She said yes to a dance at the fall festival and laughed when Silas did his careful shuffling. He'd been a better dancer when his wife was alive, but he'd never been as joyful. The phrase that had brought them to this strange rescue lost its edges. It went dull like a knife safely tucked. Sometimes it rose up in the back of Nora's throat, a reflex, and she said, "No, not that." And she said it loud enough now that the person it was me, and for herself, heard it. One night the wind went quiet, and the stars shone so close it felt indecent. They had finished supper, and the house was that good kind of warm that old wood makes. Nora washed the plates. Silas dried. He placed the last dish in the rack and turned toward her. She looked up, the kind of looking you do when you're deciding whether to take a step. He moved slow, always slow. He raised his hand and put it at the side of her face where the skin was smooth now. No bruise. He waited. She leaned. They kissed like people who had waited their whole lives to understand that a kiss could be a sentence with punctuation and not a bargain. It was not a blaze set to burn down a house. It was the first good fire in a winter hearth. They pulled away at the same moment, and both smiled, a little startled. He rested his forehead against hers because he was tall enough to do that still, and she let him. He felt grief rise up for all the times he'd been a fool, for all the women who had not been safe, for all the men who had not been stopped. He felt gratitude like a wind sweetening. "Tomorrow," he said, as if that were a plan. She nodded. They turned out the kitchen light and let the house settle into its night. Years would pass. The ranch would be bought and sold and bought back in dreams. Calves would drop and bucks would rub their antlers on his fence posts and swallows would nest in the eaves and glue their lives together with spit. May would get older and meaner and never unkind. The jar of sourdough would keep living on the counter like a pet they fed. People in the county would tell stories, some with respect and some with envy, and sometimes those stories would begin with a version of a line someone had ruined for too many. But the truth of it, the real thing, would be not a line, but a moment that fed into a life. The shy maid had said it once, thinking it a spell to keep the worst at bay. The old rancher had frozen because he knew that words could harm an entire history. He didn't trade a power he didn't own. He made coffee. He said no for her when she couldn't. Later, when she could, he gave her the space to say no for herself, and she did. Later still, they both learned how to say yes. It wasn't a miracle. It was work. It was the work of holding a life and not setting it down even when your hands were tired. It was the work of choosing and choosing again. It was the work of understanding that being what a man wants is never as good as being what you want, and that the right kind of man wants exactly that. On a morning near the end of one long summer, when the grass was gold and the cattle napped with their faces toward the breeze and the smell of tomatoes tilted the whole day toward sweetness, Nora sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee. Silas came out and eased himself down beside her. They didn't speak at first. The world was speaking loudly enough. Birds and insects and the distant machinery of neighbors haying. "I used to think I could fix the world by fixing men," she said finally, watching her feet. "Or by learning how to be the thing they wanted. I don't think that anymore." "What do you think?" he asked. "I think I can fix one life at a time. Mine first, and maybe yours a little if you let me. And maybe when enough of us do that, the world will look over and decide it wants to keep up." Silas nodded. He set his hand, old and work-worn, palm up between them. Nora put her hand in his, not because she had to, not because he expected it, but because she wanted to. The morning opened like a book. The day began again. They sat, two people, exactly themselves, the world falling into its place around them,